Um, the topic of tonight's webinar is the specter of colonial violence during military escalations and its impact on health in Israel-Palestine. Our two speakers are Alice Rothschild and Osama Tanus. You will all receive a survey at the end, and we look forward to your comments and your suggestions. We take them seriously. We really want to hear what you think and how we can improve things or meet your needs better. First, I'll introduce our two speakers and then tell you how this is going to be organized. Alice Rothschild is a retired OBGYN, an author, and an activist who has focused her interest in social justice on Israel-Palestine for over 20 years. She's written 3 books and contributed to a number of anthologies on the topic, and also directed a documentary film. She's active in the JVP Health Advisory Council, the HAC as we call it, and she is also on the board of We Are Not Numbers, as a mental health foundation. Make sure everybody's getting in. Okay. Osama Tanus, our second speaker, is a physician who is a specialized pediatrician based in Haifa and a clinical instructor in the Rappaport Faculty of Medicine in the Technion. Currently pursuing his Master of Public Health. Someone needs to mute themselves. If everyone can keep muted throughout, unless you're asking a question, that will be helpful. Okay. Back to Osama, sorry. Dr. Tanus is currently pursuing his Master of Public Health in Tel Aviv University and is a researcher for the Galilee Society, the Arab National Society for Health Research and Services. He is a 2020 Fulbright Hubert H. Humphrey Fellow in Public Health and Health Policies in Emory University in Atlanta. His research interests include structural violence and health disparities. And he's been in Atlanta for the last year. We'll be leaving soon, so we're lucky to catch him on the tail end of his visit to the US during a very strange year. Alice will first do a 15-minute historical review of the assault on Gaza, the historical context, and the most recent provocations that led up to where we are now, which, as I'm sure you all know, are continuing as we speak. And then Osama will discuss the medical consequences of the assault. Alice will speak for about 15 minutes and Osama for 25 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and chat. These are really both extraordinary people. They have both, through their comradeship, really helped me get through the last year. And I know that you will all gain a lot from tonight's program. So we will go ahead and get started with Alice. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and good evening or morning or wherever it is you are located. So the title of this seminar is The Specter of Colonial Violence During Military Escalations and Its Impact on Health in Israel-Palestine.
Whoops. Alice.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm now muted. Okay, I'm going to start all over again.
Thank you.
So welcome, everyone. The title of this webinar is The Specter of Colonial Violence During Military Escalations and Its Impact on Health in Israel-Palestine. So I'm going to give some historical context examining the history of settler colonialism in Israel-Palestine to give us a framework. And I think first we need a definition. So the definition of settler colonialism is a form of colonialism that seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers. So think the United States, think South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, but there are also some that didn't do so well, like the French in Indochina, or Algeria, the Dutch in Indonesia, and South Africa, the English in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. So the question is, how do we make this argument about Israel? And then also, why is the US, their sister colonial settler state, so supportive of Israel in its efforts? I want to first of all outline the historical paradigm so we know what we're dealing with. So the historical dominant paradigm is that Jews were victimized by anti-Semitism, which culminated in the Holocaust, and that Israel was created as a refuge. It's something special given by God. It's a thriving democracy. It's a haven for the oppressed. It's a center of culture, technology, beaches, basically a remarkable success story in a dangerous neighborhood. And in that kind of framing, Israel can do whatever it needs to do to survive, because its victimization justifies everything. And that's the framing we see in mainstream media. And it is basically the narrative of the victor. But what we're going to look to now is the narrative that's not usually heard, which is the experience of Palestinians. So when I see that, I see an early colonization of historic Palestine that started in the 1890s, that led up to the creation of the State of Israel. And we have to remember that the Zionist colonizers did not arrive in historic Palestine to share the land. They arrived to claim the land for themselves by whatever means necessary. And that culminated in the founding of the state in 48. And then in 67, we see there's further colonization of land with an increasingly belligerent occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, multiple hard to defend wars. And as the effort progressed, a growing awareness from people like us of cross-sectional issues around racism, police brutality, militarism, all what I would call forms of colonial violence. And if we look more closely, and this is, the world's briefest history lesson, 100 years ago, this region was part of the Ottoman Empire. And in the late 1800s, with the birth of political Zionism, our pal Herzl, and responses to Christian anti-Semitism in Europe, Jews felt like they needed a place of their own. And they were looking at, Uganda, Latin America, Palestine. It was really up for grabs. And after World War I, we see the colonial powers dividing the Middle East into nation states with very little regard to the indigenous peoples and their histories and identities. So, for example, if you look at the Kurds, they were split amongst 4 nations: Iraq, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. So this is not an isolated incident. Then with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, we see the advocating of a Jewish homeland, particularly in Palestine. Again, never mind the concerns of the indigenous Palestinian Arabs who live there. By 1947, we have the UN partition plan, again, not asking the opinion of the people who live there. And in 48, the founding of the state with massive US support. And this support and the support of the world basically was grounded in world guilt over the Holocaust and the horrific immigration policies that didn't allow Jews to flee the Nazis. Although many in the US government actually did oppose the partition plan. But this resulted, as we know, in the dispossession of 750,000 Palestinians and over 500 Palestinian villages destroyed. This was basically a settler colonialist dream come true. So what many people don't realize is that after 1948, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship were unable to get compensation for lost property and homes. They frequently lived near their old villages, which were demolished or settled by Jewish immigrants, or made into national parks or industrial parks, or military ranges, so that this is not how full citizens are treated. So clearly from the beginning, Palestinian citizens of Israel were the other, the enemy. And in the 1950s, with the onset of the Cold War, Israel became the bulwark against Egypt, which was allied with the Soviet Union. So the US saw this as a way to fight Arab nationalism. And Egypt was seen as the proxy for the Soviet Union. So at this point, Israel became the foot in the door for the oil-rich countries of the Middle East. And the US liked that a lot. And in this framing, the Jewish people in Israel were the good people, and the Arabs were the bad people. The Jews were people like us. They were white people creating a Western-style state in a savage, untamed region of the world. And the racism, the Islamophobia, the cultural, economic, and military imperialism, that wasn't in the forefront of many of our consciousnesses. And even Nixon claimed that Israel was, quote, one of the cops on the beat, controlling the Middle East for US interests, along with players like Iran under the Shah and Turkey. Then after 67, there was a gradual move towards making uncritical support of Israel the cornerstone of being a good Jew in the US. And we see the ability to have any kind of critical discourse narrowing. And one of the first critical decisions that Israel made after 67 was to declare the territories under control to be held or administered rather than occupied. So they felt that Palestinians were exempt from protections that were offered by the Fourth Geneva Convention. So if it's not occupied, then it's fine to settle it. So that's when the settlement movement really came into being. And we see the steady encroachment of Jewish settlements, the Israeli takeover of the Jordan Valley as a closed military zone, the division of the West Bank into smaller and smaller cantons divided by bypass roads and checkpoints, the growing Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem. This all was born after 67. And the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, according to the international community, was recognized as occupied territory. But again, the Israelis said these were disputed territories, liberated territories. They called the West Bank Judea and Samaria. So the language that people used really gave you a clue as to how they thought of the region. And this is also when we see the Christian Zionists jumping in and embracing the idea that all Jews should, quote, return to Israel. They were getting ready for Armageddon and the second coming, so we all had to get back immediately. And they started pouring all of their support and millions of dollars into the settlement movement. We also see this is the point where liberal Christians bought the glorious mythology of the state of Israel and just jumped on the bandwagon. Then when the Shah collapsed in 1979, Israel's role became even more important. And it was also by then providing subsidiary services to the US, helping the US evade sanctions against South Africa, supporting terrorist states and terrorist groups in Central America. So at this point, Israel became a very valuable client state and surrogate for the US. And then after 9/11, the US government really went into full steam ahead, developing a major military industrial complex with Israel. Israel was our partner in fighting against terrorism. It was a little high-tech startup nation, the mirror image of the US, our baby sister making it big. And so there was increasing availability of massive amounts of military might to achieve its goals. And Israel claims that after 2005, when the Jewish settlers were pulled out of Gaza, that Gaza was no longer occupied. But again, we have to look at language. There is no other description for a small region of the world that is completely controlled by another power, its air, its sea, its economy. So again, there's a real disconnect between the language that the Israelis use and the language of international law. And with this kind of framing, the history, the trauma, the rights, the aspirations of Palestinians become invisible. And the settler colonial enterprise is increasingly entrenched. So I would argue that the current occupation is actually a continuation of more than 72 years of colonization of Palestine, of treating Jews as more deserving, more human than Palestinians, and of Palestinians, like many indigenous peoples, periodically fighting back. So getting rid of the indigenous Arab population, whether actively or passively, is a fundamental part of building a Jewish state, of Zionism. So it's very painful to acknowledge, particularly after the Holocaust, that one of the consequences of founding the state of Israel was the destruction of an indigenous people who had lived there for centuries. And they were Jews, Muslims, and Christians who were actually not interested in being colonized or losing land. So this conflict, again, is not really about Arabs fighting against Jews. It's about Arabs challenging Zionism, which is a political movement that privileges Jews over everyone else. And we see that Israeli Jews are increasingly believe that the West Bank settlements help rather than hurt Israel's security. So again, this is a form of manifest destiny, which we see in these kind of movements. And in this setting, you can see what the relationship is between Zionism and racism. So if we look at the current events going on, these are basically examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about. So we know that settler colonialism has led to the forced displacement of Palestinians and the rapid expansion of Israeli settlements, and that Palestinians are forcibly displaced and isolated into enclaves where they are governed by rules that ensure their continuous dispossession and subjugation. And these oppressive rules do not apply to settlers who live either in the house next door or on the hills above them or in confiscated homes. And this is apartheid in real time. So what happened in the last couple of months? So we look at the families in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. They were expelled by Israeli soldiers from their homes in Haifa and Jaffa in 1948. There were 28 families that were settled in Sheikh Jarrah in the 1950s by the Jordanian government in coordination with UNRWA, because this area was controlled by Jordan at that point. And in the 1960s, these families made a deal with Jordan, who controlled the area, to become owners of their homes. They received official land deeds in return for announcing their refugee status with its international protection. So that means they gave up a lot to get their homes defined as that they were the owners. But after 67, the Israeli government developed a settlement plan for the area, which called for building a string of settlement units and parks around the old city and the removal of the Palestinian homes, either by outright confiscation or through endless tortured legal battles. And employing Israeli laws that allow Jews to, quote, reclaim ownership of land lost in 48, as well as a host of forged documents, settlers have challenged Palestinian ownership and repeatedly won in the Israeli courts. So for the Israeli government to call this merely a real estate dispute is unfathomably dishonest. And needless to say, Palestinians who lost homes and property in West Jerusalem or anywhere in Israel have no legal remedy. And there are currently 20,000 Palestinian homes that are at risk for demolition in the city. So this was the backdrop, and then there were a series of provocations. The first thing that happened on April 13th, the first day of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, was also Memorial Day in Israel. And the Israeli police entered Al-Aqsa Mosque, cut the cables to the loudspeakers that broadcast the prayers to the faithful from the medieval minarets, because they didn't like the sound of the muezzins calling in the middle of their big Memorial Day celebration. So that really annoyed a lot of people. Then, as Palestinians were facing more evictions, tensions were mounting, Ramadan was coming to a close, the Israeli government chose that moment to block Palestinians from outside Jerusalem from entering Al-Aqsa Mosque on one of their most sacred religious holidays, again, enraging a whole bunch more people. Violence further erupted on Jerusalem Day, which is a raucous nationalist celebration of the Israeli capture of the city in 67. So this was basically pouring acid on an already seething wound. Then, to top it off, the Israeli police stormed Al-Aqsa, firing rubber-tipped bullets, stun grenades, tear gas at praying Palestinians and others, not surprisingly, who were throwing stones. And throwing stones is basically the weapon of choice for the disenfranchised, the enraged, and the humiliated. And in that moment, 330 Palestinians were injured. And it was only then that Hamas felt obligated to respond to these repeated provocations. Now we know during the 11-day assault, the Israeli military killed 242 Gazans, including 66 children, and including the doctor who was in charge of the response to COVID-19 at Al-Shifa Hospital. 2,000 were injured, including 610 children, over 100,000 internally displaced. So civilians were clearly targeted, family residences, base infrastructure, 18 hospitals and clinics, including the only COVID-19 testing center, schools, electrical sanitation, and water purification facilities were bombed. Now, the Israeli government claims that they only do targeted bombing and that they're very good at pointing at where they want to go. But given the level of destruction of the infrastructure and the killing of civilians, you have to assume that this is actually a deliberate policy. The Hamas rockets killed 12 people in Israel, 2 of them children. Again, a highly disproportionate assault. Now, the United Nations Israeli human rights groups such as B'Tselem, Doctors Without Borders, a bunch of other human rights organizations, and news reporters have all provided strong evidence that Israel is violating international law and is committing war crimes in Gaza. You've got to remember that the military assault occurred simultaneously with the COVID-19 pandemic. And Gaza in particular, but all of Palestine, has suffered greatly from the pandemic because of Israel's ongoing refusal to provide COVID-19 vaccine and adequate medical supplies to health facilities throughout the occupied territories. Now, the interesting thing about this recent assault is that protests erupted all over the West Bank, in Nablus, Jenin, Hebron, Tulkarem, Qalqilia, and also protests erupted all over Israel. So Palestinians in Acre, Haifa, Jaffa, Lod, Nazareth, and Ramla went out into the streets. And even though the mayor of Lod called this Kristallnacht, again, evoking the Holocaust every time Palestinians fight back, what this showed us is that Palestinian citizens have reached a breaking point, that they are unable to tolerate the 72-year history of racist and exclusionary policies by the Israeli government, its most recent attacks in Jerusalem, and the ever-increasing rightward trend of the government toward and more fascistic political parties. Now, it's interesting when you say, well, did Israel learn anything? Just hours after the last ceasefire was called, Israeli police attacked Palestinians at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque on a Friday. They stormed the mosque and fired tear gas at Palestinians. This past week, they arrested both Mohammed and Muna al-Kurd, and where they were detained by Israeli military. And they are leaders in the protest against settlers trying to forcefully expel dozens of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan, another neighborhood that is being attacked by settlers. And just this week, the Israeli military attacked the Palestinian Union of Health Workers, which is a facility in Ramallah that is critical for COVID-19 relief. And this was in response to Gazans shooting up incendiary kites, which is in response to other provocations that had just happened. Now, I think the killing and displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are obviously continuing. And the thing to remember is that this is not a battle between two equal parties. This is a struggle between one of the strongest military powers in the world, backed by the US, bent on disinheriting and humiliating a people that they have already dispossessed numerous times. And this is a frightful example of ongoing violent settler colonialism, of the inability of the world to see Palestinians as equally human, traumatized, and deserving as their powerful Jewish Israeli neighborhoods and occupiers. And I would suggest, in closing, if the international community does not force Israel to deal with the root causes of this disaster, a militaristic, racist settler colonialism, this tragedy will repeat itself over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really powerful, comprehensive overview. And now we'll take a look at the specific health consequences of this history and the current situation. Osama?
Hi everyone. Thank you, Trude, for the Trude and Alice for inviting me. Thank you for JVP for their amazing work generally, and the Health Advisory Council, and for the audience. Thank you for coming here, and thanks, Alice, for a powerful and very thorough overview of the situation. I will share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Okay, good. So Alice gave us a very excellent, overview of the political situation and the pre-existing condition, and I will try to provide a further analysis of how is the medical system involved in this. Okay, so we have been a lot on the news lately in the last year, starting from the pandemic, from the debate about whether Israel has the duty to vaccinate, like from the celebration of Israel as this vaccination success story, to its obligation to vaccinate Palestinians, to its actually attack on Palestinian on COVID facilities in the West Bank, and all of that is very confusing. So I'll try to make some sense out of this. Okay, so Alice gave us an introduction of how this process looked like. As she mentioned, this is an ongoing settler colonial process that, unlike colonialism where you have an external power that dominates a population, here you have actually a population of settlers who come with their sovereignty. They do not come to integrate with the existing society, they come to replace the existing society. So, unlike the Jewish population, European Jews that went to the USA or England to become American or British, the Jewish settlement in Palestine came not to integrate not to become Palestinians, but to create a Jewish sovereignty over that land, which has expanded and is continuing to expand, right, with the annexation of settlements, building of settlements. It's also important to understand that we're not talking about very defined geographical entities. The borders of the occupied Palestinian territories have been drawn by colonial frontier expansion, so the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and then they are continuously being reshaped, right? So how is medicine a part of this? Generally, medicine and colonialism are very much tied together. Also, from the days of British and French colonialism, medicine was seen as a tool to kind of also to keep the soldiers healthy and fit so they can colonize the new land. It was seen as a civilizing mission. And unlike colonialism, in settler colonialism, because there is no clear separation between who is a soldier and who is a settler, medicine is seen as a tool to keep the whole settler enterprise fit and healthy. So it started a lot of the Hebrew Medical Association started in 1911. Settlers established mutual aid associations, and they were seen as pioneers. And public health was a tool to shape a healthy nation in order to further colonize and be much more efficient. And sickness was seen as a waste of national funds, of labor, and then that started. It was the origin of the sick funds, or what you can call Kupat Holim. It was based on the German model, and it was very much seen as a tool to bring the West and modernity into the Orient, that is, and to bring hygiene also to Palestine, which was dirty, backward, uncivilized, and so on. And shaping a healthy nation was also an end in itself, but also kind of a precondition for doing the physical task of building the national home and so on. And this has led to the creation of the modern Israeli healthcare system as we know it. So these pioneer settlers established the sick funds, these 4 sick funds that were established before the Nakba, before 1948. And then they are the backbone really of the Israeli healthcare system, also with the hospitals. So it was basically a system created by settlers for settlers, right? And it's kind of a very efficient system. It's well celebrated. It's kind of very organized and neat. There's a universal health coverage. And it is highly celebrated and efficient objectively in terms of how much money is spent on healthcare versus the life expectancy. So this is Israel here, compared to the USA that spends a huge amount of money with the worst outcomes. But we cannot be disappointed if we don't get excited from the first place and understand how this whole system is built. So of course, it's very much unequal. This is from the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics. And of course, so this is the mortality rate for 100,000. And we can see clear discrepancies in cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, most causes of mortality. And this is between the Palestinians and citizens of Israel and Israeli Jews. But also, if we look in all of historical Palestine, we can see the hierarchy of life expectancy between Jewish Israelis, Palestinians who live in Israel, Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip, right? So your location and ethnicity, and that's, clearly matters. Okay, so, and on the other side, basically, while Israelis in general and Israeli Jews enjoy this vast and efficient healthcare system, occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem created a lack of sovereignty, right? So Palestinians do not have sovereignty over their land. There is no even a social contract between the people and the government, or like there is no government in that sense. So the responsibilities of or the building, the structure of the healthcare system is very chaotic. It's a chaotic mishmash with different players. So you have the Ministry of Health, which was established after the Oslo Accords. You have the UNRWA, which is responsible for the relief and health of the refugees. You have the NGOs, you have the private sectors and different hospitals and complexes, and it is all built in a complex mishmash with all of this on the top of a very geographically fragmented geography between the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, checkpoints, walls, all of that. And a large majority of the population is refugees. So in terms of the UNRWA's responsibility in the West Bank is something like 28%. In the Gaza Strip, almost more than half, 2/3 of the population are refugees. So there are clear disparities. And so there is no national health insurance system. There is for the people that do have a national health insurance, some of it is governmental, some is by UNRWA. Again, just to draw an image of something that is very chaotic and mediocre at best, right? Because that entire system is under the restrictions of living under military occupation. So in terms of development, even building permits, building materials, training of physicians, and generally having a social contract, all of that is a kind of impossible under military occupation. What makes things even much more complicated, that things have been over decades de-developed, and the Palestinian healthcare system has been pushed to, instead of becoming more efficient because it has no way to invest in itself, it has been built on purchasing health services from outside. So whether it's Jerusalem, Egypt, but also mainly Israel. So a lot of the money and the cash that is spent on the health of the Palestinians ends up going and fueling the Israeli healthcare system, the same settler system that was a part of that settler infrastructure, and that further de-develops the Palestinian system. And that process is only going worse with time. So we can see that there's a clear trend of further referrals outside of the system. The system is not being more, the Palestinian healthcare system is not being more efficient and then being able to treat its own patients. No, it's referring further patients to Israel. And then again, Israel is benefiting from medical tourism, right? And these are just some numbers from the Palestinian Ministry of Health. So from these almost $260 million, 70 millions are only referrals inside the green line, inside Israel, versus other referrals to Egypt and Jordan. So we're practically talking about a captive healthcare system. Now, this is what's happening on the ground. What should be the case? First of all, and again, just to frame that the whole concept of structural racism and its effect on health, which has been well developed in the USA, by Nancy Krieger and others, how historical trauma, ecosystem degradation, land alienation, inadequate medical care, response to discrimination, all of these processes work together throughout times from 48 until now to continuously shape a very different health outcomes for Israelis and for Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jerusalem, and inside of Israel. So the whole social determinants of health play a major role in that. And just as Alice mentioned, why do we talk about racism? Because we are talking about systemic racism, a form of structuring opportunities and assigning value. And in the USA, it's based on how the interpretation of how one looks, which determines your race, whether you're white or black or Asian and so on. In Israel, it's by religion. So by your religion affiliation, that is the assigning of value and opportunities. And that leads up to having different biological expression of discrimination and inequalities. Okay, so Alice has mentioned the belligerent occupation. What do we mean? First of all major global entities, the UN Security Council, General Assembly, and other most of the major countries recognize Israel as the fighter, the belligerent occupying power that has control over territories. The Fourth Geneva Convention in 1949 was developed especially to determine what is the rights of population under occupation, what do they deserve, what is the obligation of the occupying power, and they were designed in a way where military occupation was seen as something temporary. It was not seen as something that would go on for years and decades. It should be something temporary. It should not exist, in the first place, but if it does, for temporary, and it should be kind of costly to the occupying power. It is not that easy to occupy another territory and population, because with occupation comes responsibilities. So it clearly states that the occupying power is the power in charge. It cannot destroy any property, buildings, and so on. It has, to the fullest extent available, the duty of ensuring food supplies and medical supplies to the population it occupies. It has the duty of ensuring and maintaining the health status of the hospitals, the medical establishment, of also a clear a duty to combat the spread of infectious diseases, epidemics, and allow personnel to carry on their duties. And it clearly states that any aid, charity or relief does not alleviate the occupying power from its responsibilities, right? Because this would be always the case. You will always have foreign and international bodies trying to relieve and to support, but this again does not relieve the occupying from from any of its responsibilities, and these attempts should not be blocked, the relief attempts. And it clearly says that if there is any agreement between the occupying power and any kind of authority under occupation, this again does not alleviate the occupying power from its duties. Right, because it was imagined that communities and territories under occupation would be pressured to sign agreements with the occupying power, right? So any agreement, so this was literally envisioning or propheting the Oslo Accords, that it does not alleviate the occupying power. And this is what happened during the Oslo Accord. The Oslo Accords was signed in 1991. They're, of course, hugely controversial and unjust, but they were seen, at least by some people, as a way, or they were celebrated as this peace process that would lead to a two-state solution, to an independent Palestinian state that is near the Israeli state. So it was seen as something that would lead the way to an independent Palestinian state that would try to provide the healthcare to and other duties to the Palestinian people. So during the Oslo Accords, the powers and responsibilities in the sphere of health in the West Bank and Gaza Strip were transferred to the Palestinian side. And this is the argument you will hear very often, that Israel has no obligation, it has no duties, and Israel really goes back and forth between saying that it has fulfilled all of its duties towards the Palestinian, to saying that it does not have any duties at all whatsoever, and it strategically does not define these duties. right? So, and it's always back and forth with endless discussion, which now we can clearly say that the Oslo Accords or any accords do not alleviate Israel from its responsibilities and duties. And again, these were signed while imagining that a new Palestinian state would rise up, where it will have airports and ports and can freedom of movement to build materials, to have sovereignty, not to have checkpoints, not to have settlements, and can kind of invest in the structure. It was just giving Israel an easy and comfortable occupation to maintain. Right. So what we saw before COVID, was a systematic de-development of the health system. And this is an important concept. It was coined by Sarah Roy, which is different from underdevelopment. It is a systematic de-development of the healthcare system through systematic, oppression, siege, the restrictions of movements, permits, walls, checkpoints, blockade, active bombing and destruction of hospitals and killing of personnel and so on. During COVID, while we saw that the occupying power has clear responsibility also in times of pandemic and contagious infectious diseases, it sparked an entire debate, whether Israeli has a duty or not. But then Israel systematically was blocking the efforts by Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank when Israel was not vaccinating or testing Palestinians in Jerusalem, and the Palestinian Authority started a testing center, and then a testing center. It was dismantled by Israel. It was blocking efforts by the Palestinians themselves. It was continuing, to demolish houses during the pandemic and so on. But then on and on, what we saw in medical journals, also in the Lancet, among others, and generally praising of this cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian of shipments or any kind of giving, while Israel was, repetitively and systematically sabotaging the COVID response in the West Bank, to the absurd situation where it would kind of, in a way, Gaza was responsible to take care of its own COVID vaccines. How can Gaza do that under the strict and hermetic siege, the destruction of the port and airport, and so on, to attack on COVID facilities and personnel? Right, so it's an entire spectrum of colonial and settler colonial violence on the health of Palestinians and on the healthcare infrastructures and facilities that escalates and goes back and forth, but it's always ongoing. So in terms of attacks on healthcare, they go on from the most spectacular form, which we have seen recently, of direct bombing of clinics, of infrastructures, of roads to hospitals, of part of hospital, to a debilitating siege in Gaza, and then to a more kind of fluid control of the West Bank that blocks any attempt to build a healthcare system, to the targeted killing, and assassination of health personnel. This is the nurse Al-Najjar, Razan Al-Najjar, who was a 20-year-old nurse working in Gaza, who was killed while wearing her nurse outfit during the Great March of Return, to the shutdown, just these very recent example of shutdown of the Palestinian health community works clinics in the West Bank, to the killing of personnel. So it's a very, and some of them make the headlines and make news in the top news in the New York Times and so on, and US media, and some go continuously, without being reported, without seen as spectacular, and so on. So just in the latest war, more than 200 people were killed, including more than 60 children. 6 hospitals were damaged, 9 clinics were damaged, including the MSF trauma clinic, attack of a water plant. The main COVID clinic was bombed, 2 physicians were killed. There's a recent nice article in the British Medical Journal that summarizes all the attacks on healthcare. So on and on. It's an but these things, as you said, as I said, these things make the news. They are shocking. They're so on, but they should be seen as a part of an integral spectrum. And then it becomes quite impossible to measure the effects of this war or that war from the effects of the ongoing situation of settler colonialism on the health of Palestinians. And again, I know it's very easy to celebrate international aid and relief attempts and so on. And this is again kind of an article that was well celebrated from the Lancet, that the health of Palestinians is a global responsibility. And although it might be, well intentioned, and so on, but it is not a global responsibility, and we should not frame it that way, because that alleviates Israel from what is the responsibility of Israel as an occupying power, and why is it a global responsibility? And then what does this even mean? So what is the world duty towards Palestinians? And will it again and again end up in charity and in humanitarian medicine? And like my experience in that, while I'm a part of Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, and part of their clinics, mobile clinics to the Gaza Strip, and the whole framing, and I wrote this article, you can see it in the Middle East Research and Information Project, of the practicing, medicine or in Gaza as humanitarian, where you either have this like revolving doors of sending physicians inside Gaza, then sending patients outside of Gaza to be treated back and forth in the humanitarian framework. And this over and over, doesn't. It's similar to the aid framework when dealing with Africa or Southeast Asia and other previously global South nations, but in a more toxic way, because it really goes nowhere, and it alleviates the occupier or the colonizer from its power. And then but it makes people feel good, that they have done something, they have donated, that something is being done, while it is kind of maintaining the very old system, that generates misery and suffering and killing and diseases. So instead of tackling that entire structure and saying, how can we stop and decolonize Palestine, liberate the Palestinians, it reframes it into, how can I make the Palestinians suffer less, or how can I alleviate their pain, or so on. So always say, Palestine needs liberation, not medication. It's not about sending more medicine into Gaza or the West Bank. Yeah, and thank you very much. I hope that was clear and that I was not speaking too fast. Thank you.
Thank you
Maybe
so
I would
much.
also like to say, I'm going to
Yes.
I would also like to say, I'm going to try to put something in the chat. Yes, that if people are interested in things to do, that our website, which is jvp.org, has a weekly COVID-19 timeline, has a monthly media watch looking at health and human rights projects and issues, and has all the petitions we've been talking about, and also has a way to sign up to get the emails from the Health Advisory Council, so that people can learn more and know what the hot topics are.
Okay, I think Osama, I think you need to stop sharing your screen, maybe? Can other people?
I think he stopped.
I
Okay.
stopped. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm sorry. Can people see me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll just look at a blank screen. That was really terrific, both presentations. And to start off the questions, and please go ahead and put questions in the chat if you want to ask questions of either or both speakers. Do you want to comment at all on each other's presentation? They were so complimentary, and I wondered if you had thoughts that were stimulated by listening to each other. no necessity to do this, just giving you a chance, giving you the first chance.
Well, I think that, Osama's presentation really shows how settler colonialism is focused. One of its focuses is on healthcare, and how healthcare is used by settler colonialists and also colonized by itself. And so what we see now is examples of that. And so I think you're right. It was very complementary because we're both looking at history and facts and coming up with the same story.
Yes,
Osama?
indeed, it was, I had a slide saying definition of colonialism versus settler colonialism before that. Then I felt that Alice would cover that. So it was really, complimentary, and she did an excellent overview. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'll throw out another question while people are getting their thoughts together. It's been surprising, not surprising, to see in the last week or two that even though we would certainly expect from the conditions that we just learned about, we would certainly expect to see an escalation of COVID-19 in Gaza and all the occupied territories subsequent to the recent assaults and the general lack of resources, standard of living. But we're hearing, if anything, either no information or actually hearing that things have improved. And I wondered if you could comment, either one of you could comment on that. The likelihood of that being true and why we're not getting more accurate information.
So I'll start because I've been doing this weekly COVID-19 timeline with Trudy. We are the COVID-19 timeline team. And so for many, many weeks, there's been just an overwhelming number of articles and news reports and all sorts of stuff coming out about what's going on. And in the last couple of weeks, there's been a dramatic drop off. And if you think about it, COVID-19 is going to flare when a population is all crowded together in UN schools, that has no opportunity to socially distance, that doesn't have any clean water to wash their hands. I mean, the sort of petri dish to make a pandemic explode is what happened in Gaza during the 11 days of the assault. And the other thing that happened during the assault is that there were no vaccines brought into Gaza. So whatever puny little efforts are being made to get vaccines into Gaza, there was like a break in that effort for 11 days. And now it's beginning to pick up again, but it's still grossly inadequate. There's something like maybe 5% of Palestinians are vaccinated, something in that mode. So that the whole vaccination program went on, life support. And also the hospitals are filled with wounded people. So the ability of the hospitals to care for people who are sick is reduced. And then with the bombing of the testing center, the ability to do community testing basically stopped. The last time I saw anything related to testing, the article said that the only people that are being tested are people who are hospitalized already with COVID-19 symptoms. So I don't know if it's still true, but I think that there's still no general community testing or community testing of people who have mild symptoms. So the other thing is that since Gaza is an extremely young population, I mean, like 50% of people are under 25 or some ridiculously large number. We may never know because those people tend not to get really sick. So because there's not testing and there's not a healthcare system that can deal with them, there's a sort of silent burst of the epidemic that, I'll bet you is happening, but we have no data to support that. The numbers that we have reporting, and we have a graph every week that shows the numbers that I can glean from the sources we got. Basically, fewer numbers are coming in, and it's clearly not accurate.
Do you want to add anything to that, Osama?
No, this is exactly the point I wanted to make.
Yeah.
So,
okay, great. Some questions are coming in along with lots of appreciation for your presentations. Johanna has just asked, wouldn't Israel's own self-interest require that in a pandemic, they test, treat, and vaccinate the population in the occupied territories? And this is something I ask myself all the time. Does either one of you want to comment on that?
Yes, I can start. And then, so yes, we always and even Israeli public health scholars and teams have all from the beginning. Some of them, at least, have said that we're talking about one epidemiological unit. So of course, the logic is to, even if not from a human right and obligation concept, but from pragmatic way, to vaccinate everyone and so on. But also the decision-making process is not made by physicians and public health scholars. And we saw that this is really an extreme case of biopolitics, really, of like whose lives matter and who doesn't. From the beginning. So, and of course, these communities, like the settlers and the Palestinians in the West Bank, they don't really mix, right? So the settlers are in Jewish exclusive settlements that have vaccinated. So they're not kind of, going to the market in Ramallah or Bethlehem or so on. There isn't a lot of that sense of mixing. But when there was, and then when there was the whole debate about whether Israel should vaccinate, it vaccinated the construction workers, that the Palestinian construction workers that go inside Israel, because they would pose a threat to the Israelis. So you only vaccinate people that you can exploit, right? Palestinians have very little career options. So a major part of the population works in construction, because in the West Bank, because there is very little ways to make a living. And then if you enter to Israel and have a permit, we will vaccinate you so you don't contaminate us. Otherwise, you're not worthy of vaccination, right? So it's a very twisted logic of necropolitics, in that sense, of whose life matters and whose life doesn't. Yeah. And especially now that the Israeli population is vaccinated, so it kind of gives this biological superiority. Alice, you have something?
The thing that I think is really short-sighted about Israelis is that they're not 100% vaccinated. And there is a discrepancy between Palestinian citizens and Jewish citizens, and also between many ultra-Orthodox were unwilling to be vaccinated. So it's not like Israelis aren't susceptible. And for Israelis to have a highly unvaccinated population that they're living next to, and that are, taking care of their grandmothers and picking up their garbage and doing the things that Palestinian workers do in Israel, in a setting where there's going to be the burst of new variants because the population isn't vaccinated, is very short-sighted on Israel's part, whether or not they care, or this is necropolitics or whatever. There are going to be more variants in the unvaccinated Palestinian population, and that's going to put the Israeli population at risk. So this is another part of the pathology.
Thanks. There's a question from Ethel about the settlers, wondering where they come from. Are they all Americans? Are there Russians? Are there nationals from other countries in the settlements?
The settlements in the West Bank?
Yes, if the Zionist settlers are coming primarily from the United States or also from other countries.
Well, it depends, because you have ideological settlements, and then they can be American or French and so on. People who really believe this is the land of Israel and it's our duty to colonize it and so on. And then you have what you might call, financial settlers, because Israel made living in the settlements very attractive. So you have you can have a nice house with a nice garden in a relatively cheap price. You have a lot of kind of tax benefit, and it's a much more in that sense friendly living environment than living inside Tel Aviv or Jerusalem in that sense. So some people who might be from different ethnic backgrounds go to the settlements because it's simply cheaper, but I really don't know hardcore statistics about that.
Okay. I have a question about an article that came out this week by a Vietnamese person living in North America, who discussed the parallels that they saw between the US bombing of Vietnam based on lies aimed at civilians and Israel's aerial assault on Gaza. And I wondered if you might want to comment on sort of similarities and differences, unique aspects of this occupation and the colonial situation um, in relation to other historical and current situations.
Yeah, definitely. I think the amount and the chaoticness in that sense of the bombing. I haven't lived through the Vietnam War, but of course that might resemble similarities. But I think what is very different, and it's always important to remember that Gaza is a tied up, prison that is locked. So even when it's bombed, people have nowhere to run and to escape. And Vietnam was a much larger area, and lots of forests and so on. So Gaza is a very dense urban area. It's kind of like a big slum of New Delhi, of New Mexico or Cairo. That amount of huge urban crowded environment. And then especially so in previous wars, sometimes they would send these messages to the houses to say, we're going to bomb your house in 15 minutes or half an hour, leave to in some of the cases. But now it was completely chaotic, so people also have nowhere to run and nowhere to go, and within a crowded urban areas. So it's very, and then you cannot become refugee, you're already a refugee, then you cannot escape that. So I'm sure there are similarities, but there are also differences.
Yeah, and I think the difference is that the U.S. was occupying Vietnam, whereas the Israelis are a settler colonial occupation, which has a different goal. But I think that one of the parallels is the willingness of white people to bomb people of color and the devaluing of life of people who are of color. And that is part of the racism that links both of those conflicts. The idea that weaponry is going to change people's minds, and I think that is definitely a parallel.
Thanks. Rachel has asked about the effects on mental health, if you could comment on that.
Yes, definitely. So, where does one start, right? And how do you even measure that? And how can you really strongly measure that? So, I would urge people. There was a nice article in the American Scientific recently by Yasser Abu Jameh. He's the head of the Gaza mental health clinics, and try to find it and put it in the chat, which talks about the mental health, catastrophic mental health effects of the war in Gaza. But in a way, I'm just now working on a project where we are trying to explore the trauma and PTSD when it comes to refugees and to and the whole the coining of PTSD was very much a westernized concept, right, by the American soldier who goes to Vietnam. He sees the horrors of the war. He is traumatized. He goes back to America, and he suffers from PTSD, and the trauma is within the individual, within himself, right? Now we are talking about a very different thing. It's entire communities who have been exposed to massively exposed to political violence, all of them together, right? So it's not like your experience is that dramatically different from the one of the person next to you or the other thousand and million that is there, right? So it's a massive exposure to trauma. And then, the whole measurement of, how many people develop PTSD symptoms and so on doesn't really capture, right? Because you're not seeing your effects as unique, right? It's part of a larger community that has been all of it exposed, and then a lot of people tend, and not for the first time, right, for the second, and it's repetitive exposure to trauma and to siege and so on. But then how do we even measure that? Like, do you go on to and do a survey and see how many people develop this and that symptoms, and you can say 40% have PTSD symptoms? That we don't even have appropriate tools to measure when entire population. And this, I think, might be true, to of course, is true to Syria and to other conflicts in Latin America and Kashmir and so on. But we really need to think beyond. There are of course devastating mental health effects, but measuring them would be even challenging, and reporting them and conceptualizing them. We are now just trying to conceptualize a framework that can capture the mental health effect of political violence on massive populations.
And I think I work with a group called We Are Not Numbers. You can look up their website if you want. And this is, we mentor young Gazans 18 to 30 who want to be writers and journalists to write about their personal experiences. And if you really want to have a very in-depth, in-person, insightful idea of the mental health consequences of the recent assault and living under siege in general, I think reading the essays by these young people is incredibly eye-opening and important, and they are clearly a voice that needs to be heard and that cuts through. Are they Hamas? Are they this? These are the people who are writing essays while they're afraid they're going to die. And I think there's nothing like hearing it from the voice of the writer that makes it very powerful. So I do recommend people look up We Are Not Numbers for more in-person reporting and feelings.
Thanks. Trying to find this. Here, it's a message from Liz Horowitz, who I think is posing a very important question. She says, I really respect your view about, quote, charity of the NGOs and nonprofits versus support for the Palestinian struggle. As a healthcare worker and a public health person, I'm really interested in what we can do to support Palestinian medical people in their work to care for the population.
Yeah, thank you. That's really an important question, and I wish I had an easy, answer, because I myself I struggling in that, and I always struggle with, because I do go on these humanitarian missions to Gaza, and the first time I went, I was just so devastated and felt useless, and how impotent. And I was talking to my other friends who either from Iraq, who practiced humanitarian medicine in Lebanon or in other settings, and they all shared the same frustration, but then they all just just go, and they, even exposure itself might bring up some answers. So I'm not saying that there should not be aid and charity. Of course, in the meantime, it's better than having nothing, but it should not be limited to this, and we should aspire to changing the entire discourse. So whenever of how we write about Palestine, that it should not be Israel should allow vaccination to enter and so on. No, to always talk about decolonization, ending the occupation as the only sustainable solution that will do that. And there was last year when the pandemic started, a piece in the Lancet Global Health, which kind of compared Gaza to a prison, and then saying, and people are calling to let prisoners out because so maybe the solution would be the right of return for Gazans. And that article lasted 3 days in the Lancet because it was deleted and so on. And later on, the authors wrote a very excellent piece in the BMJ, who just came out recently, about the silencing. So we're even in that stage of silencing, any narrative in the medical journals that talk about liberation in Palestine, about decolonization, ending the occupation, and it's always carefully, drafted against the humanitarian and the charity. So we need to pressure towards, ending military aid to Israel and framing war and occupation as a public health hazard. And as so, just in the U.S., after efforts and years, people have managed to talk about to reframe police brutality as a public health hazard, or systemic racism, or segregation. And this was, I assume, was not clear all along the way, right? And it was not the mainstream in medical literature or mainstream, but we can push towards that. And and things are changing in the US in the coverage of Palestine, right? And Israel. Adam really has been pushed, and we should all just work, as Noor Arafat said, to push it further, to break it, and then to advocate for decolonization. And then each group can come up with its own tools, whether it's pressuring or advocacy or boycotting and different issues, but not to settle for charity.
And I think in order to not exceptionalize Israel, this is a dilemma that all healthcare providers face. You know, you've got to treat the kid with lead poisoning, but you've also got to work on legislation to get rid of lead paint. You know, you've got to treat, you know, the teenager who's got preeclampsia, but you also have to work for Medicare for all. And so as healthcare providers, we should be, you know, attuned to the fact that our job is to take care of patients, but also to not lose sight of the fact that patients live and are healthy or are sick in a socio-political context. And if we're going to be really good at what we do, we have to pay attention to both the individual in front of us and the socio-political context in which they are, you know, diseased. And I think that's something that Rita Jacquemin at Berzeit has really helped us to understand. And I think it's true in every medical setting.
Will Thomas has asked, have the recent attacks on Palestinians in East Jerusalem at the Damascus Gate, in Al-Aqsa, and the latest military assault on Gaza created a new sense of unity among Palestinians in these areas, as well as in 1948 Israel? And what might be the consequence of this new sense of unity?
Yeah, most definitely. You know, it was very frustrating for me to explore, experience the latest events from being based in the US. Usually, I'm in Haifa and I'm like on the street and with the organizers. So this is something that we have always been chanting when we go to the streets. Always شعب واحد مش شعبين. You know that we're like one people, not two peoples. The Palestinians in Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and the علم واحد مش علمين. Like we have one flag, not two flags. And like, you know, and that we're one people, one wound, one struggle, all of that. And they were, but at the end of the day, their lived realities are very different. So we can go on and say these sentences, but the lived experience, of course, is different from Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem and Haifa and Nazareth and Beirut, right? But there was something I think different in the latest event, that it really spread throughout the entire region, and people were because it was very much decentralized. So it was all these endless unregistered youth movement who were organizing everywhere. And you have people from Al-Fahim and Haifa going to Jerusalem and back, and you know, all across Gaza and the West Bank. And the different activities, whether the general strike all over, so yes, there was something that really enhanced the feeling of unity, and that and also having the, you know, the settlers march in cities like Haifa and led inside the Green Line, which are often so that kind of spectacular violence that was not always the case. You know, kind of you saw a mixing and spillage of different scenes. And that was very powerful and created a much more a sense of unity that already was there. And I think a big part of that was also the marginalization of the official leadership, because throughout years, you know, Israel has created occupation leads to fragmentation and to so you have leadership, the PA, you know, in the West Bank, that speaks only about Ramallah and doesn't speak, of course, about the entire people. It's corrupt, doesn't speak about Palestinians inside Israel. You have Hamas that speaks in the name of Gazans, but suddenly the young people were talking in the names of all Palestinians, because you did not have these kind of pragmatic, opportunistic political leadership, and it was very much grassroots. So yes, that was definitely a phenomenon.
And one of the things I found really interesting was the sort of shock of Jewish Israelis, that they thought we were all getting along, and they couldn't believe how angry Palestinians were. And for me, that speaks to the blindness of Jewish Israelis living next to Palestinian Israelis. And it was sort of almost sort of stunning to think that it hadn't occurred to people that there's a whole population that, you know, has less funding, lives in segregated villages, doesn't have the same opportunities, you know, blah, 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 blah. And that they would object to this is like, oh my God, you know, I just found that really fascinating, sort of sociologically.
It's inspiring to see both the frustration and the enthusiasm in the chat from so many people from so many places in different parts of the world, really wanting to do more, And one of the themes in this has been frustration in the chat, has been frustration with the media and how to break through to the media to get the truth told. Um, I think Elizabeth, I think in Canada, mentioned that the Canadian Broadcasting Company won't allow Palestine to be the language. Palestine cannot be mentioned on CBC. And, we saw a few cracks in this recently during this recent crisis, but we still have a tremendous challenge in trying to get the truth into the media and out to the people. Do you have any comments on suggestions, strategies?
Well, JVP just had a whole action to call out Facebook, which censors Palestinian voices. So I think, we just have to keep organizing and keep calling out media outlets. And, every time there's something in a media outlet and every time NPR just completely blows it, anytime your newspaper in your area doesn't report things with any level of accuracy, it's our job to write to the editor, to have an action, to call them out, to join organizations that are like calling out Facebook, that kind of thing. We just have to keep doing what we're doing. And I think that the thing that I find, I've been doing this for almost 25 years, and the thing that I find really interesting is that because of social media, because lots of people have smartphones in places where no one has been heard. It's very hard to miss what's happening if you want to pay attention. So it's our job as privileged people to uplift the voices of the people who are yelling and screaming and saying we need to be heard, and then to push our institutions to change their ways. And I think, I'm not like a thrilled person with New York Times, but I think that there was a major turnaround with them hiring Patrick Kingsley. He has done much, much better coverage than the New York Times has ever done. And you start hearing, the word occupation mentioned on NPR and, mainstream sources like that. So it is changing. It's like snail's pace, but I do think that we're having an impact and that that's important.
Thanks. Okay, I'm sorry. Osama, did you want to comment on that?
No, I'm not an American citizen, so I just got this glimpse of the last year in the US, and as you said, it felt like really things are changing. There were headlines about even the right of return, right, in the New York Times, and so on. But then what we felt like, me and a bit of my friends who tried to send opinion letters and so on, either to the Washington Post or the New York Times, it really felt there was like kind of, it was a discussion between American Jews and other American Jews, or American Jews and Israeli Jews, about the right of Palestinian, and less Palestinian voices. And there was some, you had some 2 or 3 here and there, but it, of course, much less than what you would expect, right, in the time of war on Palestine. So of course, there are still so many levels of silencing that are there. But what else can we do? Of course, we need to keep on changing, and also find alternative platforms, right? So the Jacobin was doing excellent job, the Nation, and more progressive platforms. So yeah, definitely.
Thanks. I
And
think
Democracy Now!
Yeah,
Yeah,
democracy.
yeah. To put in a plug for our updates also, if you even glance at the updates, you'll get a sense of some alternative media and other places where you can get some information that may not be in your local newspaper. Although, if you can get letters and opinion pieces in your local newspapers, and you're more likely in a small town where they need those, it's always worth a try. I'm sorry for those of you if I didn't get to your questions, but I think we're beginning to lose some people, and I want to start to wrap up. Our next, I mentioned before that we had originally scheduled this date for a presentation by Dr. Mariam Hussein discussing the impact of occupation and siege on cancer diagnosis and care in the occupied territories. And that will be rescheduled, so look for that. I can't give you a date, but we definitely will plan for that in the future. The next in our regular sequence of webinars will be in September, and the topic will be race, health, and Black Palestinian solidarity. And the speakers will be Armin Henderson, a physician who works with Dream Defenders, and Peter Sporn, MD, who is one of the members of the JVP Health Advisory Committee and the Health Advisory Council and the steering committee. So we'd also like to invite you to become a more active member with the Health Advisory Council. Please feel free to sign up on the website just to keep in touch with the various sources of information, or become more active and see what role that you might be able to play. We have an evaluation survey now, do we, for you to take? Okay, so
The survey is sent to everyone who comes to who signed up for the webinar.
okay, so we're going to ask you, please, to fill out the survey. And if you have action ideas, suggestions, other questions you think we need to be addressing, any comments you would like to share with us, please use the evaluation form as a way to do that. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for being part of this struggle.
Thank you, Alice, Trude, and all the audience. Thank you for arranging this and for inviting me. Yeah, I wish I contributed. I hope I contributed a bit to better understanding, and looking forward to stay in touch.
And thank you, Osama. We look forward to hearing you from Israel when you go back, and everything you have to share with us and teach us.
Right.
Thank you.
So I'm going to officially end this, Trudy. Are you?
Yes. I didn't know if we had to keep it up for people to do the.
No, the survey will be sent to them. It's not.
Okay,
it's not on the recording.
Great. Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we'll be seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much.